I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, before we begin this edition of the show, I'd like to remind you that it is you, the listener, that makes this show possible. I have no advertisers or sponsors at this time other than my Patreon supporters. So, if you want to help the show out, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. On this edition of the show, we're going to be speaking with Malu Halasa, co-editor with Jordan Elgrably of Sumūd, a new Palestinian Reader. We're going to get an insight into Palestinian culture and its relationship to political resistance. So, with that being said, let's get right to it with Malu Halasa. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very, very happy to have on, Malu Halasa, who is the editor of a new volume we're going to be discussing entitled Sumūd, Essays, Memoir, Fiction, Poetry, and Art from the Markaz Review, a new Palestinian Reader. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm fine. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into the book itself, maybe you could tell my listeners about the Markaz Review, because I've had Jordan on before, but that was a while ago, and I think my listeners would be really interested in learning about the review.
Well, Jordan is my co-editor on Sumūd, and the Markaz Review is a arts, literary, cultural online magazine that covers the Swana or MENA region. And it's been going, this will be our 5th year that we've been going. And the Markaz Review, Markaz means center, the center. And our thing is that the Middle East, North Africa, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, it's not over there. It's the center of the world. So that's really our that's what we do at the Markaz Review, is that we're bringing those writers, those ideas, those views from Palestine and beyond. They're central to the sort of writing and the artwork and the fiction that we feature in the Markaz Review. We have Friday editions, but also monthly themed editions. And March, our theme for March is love, war, and resistance.
Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean the center of the world?
Well, the Middle East is a construct. It was considered like those countries over there. They're not part of the mainstream. They're in the Middle East, or it's a way of that area of the world, or Arabic speaking countries were sort of downgraded. They're never really seen as the main event. the main movers and shakers in the world that we're living in. And actually, when you think of the wars that have gone on and how the culture, how the for example, when you think about Syria, Syria was the oldest urbanized culture. Damascus is one of the ancient cities of the world. Our ideas of multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism comes from Cairo, Syria, Damascus, Beirut. We don't think of those ideas as somehow the West has claimed them, but they've come from someplace else. That great mosaic of Christians, Muslims, and Jews living together. That's from that part of the world. It's not, America doesn't have diversity is not just American, it's also from that part of the world. What's quite interesting is that one of the writers we have in the Markaz Review, Huda Hamid, she was writing about Bisara or indentured servitude from the point of view of a young Bisara girl. And her country, her family, their skin color was different, and this young woman, the way that she educated herself was through reading, and one of the books that she read was Uncle Tom's Cabin. So there's an exchange between East and West. But I think in the West, we like to think of that part of the world as kind of separate, but it's not.
Yeah, in a way, the title, the Markaz review, it's pushing back on these. I mean, I'll just flatly say it. There's sort of, I think, a racist conception in the West of the Arab world, where it's almost viewed as, oh, look at these war-torn people, and we don't just see them, we just see them as war-torn and not having a culture. And in a way, I think the Markaz review is pushing back on that view of, you know, this world as being the other, the cultureless other. No, there is a real culture there. And I think that'll be a good segue into Sumūd.
Okay, great. I just wanted to say about that is that one thing that the Markaz Review has done is that we've built a platform for voices from that part of the world, and kind of going into it's also been a place where we've been very keen to feature Palestinian voices. And I think I've been working, I'm the literary editor at the Markaz Review, and I've been there for like 3 years now. And some of the writing that we have in Sumūd comes from the very early days when we were featuring Palestinian writing at the Markaz Review. And some of the writing and the poetry and the fiction in Sumūd it has been very current, that it's happened either before October 7th or after, during the war on Gaza.
One thing I was interested in talking about, and we'll get to the title of the book, but I wanted to, uh, sticking on that point of, I think sometimes people don't really understand that Palestinians do have a culture, and I think that's an interesting thing to tackle. That's why I like the book so much, is because it's not just about politics, it's about culture. And sometimes I think people don't look at the culture or the fact that, Palestinians have a rich culture. They have poetry, they have fiction. And I'm interested in talking about why you and Jordan wanted to highlight that and look at the cultural aspect and not just the sort of politics.
I kind of feel I've been doing anthologies that I did an anthology of Syrian voices in art during the Syrian Revolution, and I've done collections of essays and art and cartoons from Iran. And what I've noticed is that once there's a country in conflict or war, you never really hear of the voices of the people there. And it's really important that when there's these sorts of conflicts and war, that you go to the people and you hear what their concerns are and not not only what their concerns are, but in culture, I think that people reveal who they are and their aspirations and the very things that keep them going. And I think for the Palestinians, Sumūd, or steadfastness, or keeping strong, is also a cultural response, is that they refuse to be erased. So their poets wrote poetry. Their artists refused, even when they weren't really allowed to have art exhibitions by the Israelis. They would have art exhibitions in town halls and schools, even when they weren't allowed to have the colors of their flag in their art. They still developed a metaphorical language with the watermelon as just one of many symbols where they could show their national pride, or they could use those colors. And I think that one of the things that the Israeli occupation has tried to do, and the Nakba, when the Nakba happened in 48, I mean, people were fleeing for their lives. They didn't really have a chance to think about. It took a while. Like when we think of Palestinian political posters, people fled the Nakba, everything was destroyed. It really took them until the early 50s in Beirut to start doing visual production. So definitely war, displacement, sudden migration will affect culture and stop people from producing what they do culturally. However, eventually they get on track. And in the occupied territories and in Gaza after 67, when it became like a territory of, controlled by Israel, people definitely had to push back against the Israeli authorities. And culture was the way that they did that. So, oh yeah. Oh, so just to go on, Sumūd, the real heart of Sumūd is a discussion of the relationship between culture and resistance. That's what's at the heart of the book.
I was just going to ask you to elaborate on that. What is that connection between culture resistance and what it means to be a Palestinian?
I think that I guess it's interesting that the person who really explored one of the things that the book has, other than poetry and fiction and memoir and reportage, is that we included critical literary essays. And Ian Pape, who's an Israeli new historian.
Right, right. Yeah, we've had him on the show before, actually.
Well, see, so Ian Pape, he has written about culture and resistance in a book called Imagining Palestine. And that book review is really where he lays out the argument of Palestinian cultural resistance. The one way that the Palestinians really declared among themselves and to the world, we are here, we exist, is through their culture. And culture in terms of whether we're talking about the political writings of Edward Said, the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish, or we're talking about the four great artists that started the Palestinian modern art: Vera Tamari, Slimane Mansour, Nabil Anani, people like that. They were able to establish and work despite what was going on. I mean, I think a really good example of cultural resistance is the 2002 installation that Vera Tamari did. It was called at the time "Going for a Ride?" ? And this took place at a time that there was an Israeli incursion into Ramallah, Jenin, and Al Bira. And the tanks went down the streets of Ramallah, and the streets were too small. So the tanks crushed all the cars that were parked on the street. And what Vera Tamari did was that she took the crushed cars, she took them to a field that part that she tarmacked. It was the Friends School in the Quaker School in Allah, and tarmacked a part of the field.
Hello?
Thought, well, she was busy and she was going to come back and take more
You just
photographs. Oh,
look,
did I disappear?
yeah, you I think you said Ramallah and then it like cut out for 30
Oh,
seconds.
okay. So I'll go back. The installation that she did was called "Going for a Ride?" ? And this was taking place during a time when it was an Israeli incursion into Ramallah, Al-Bira, and Jenin. And the tanks, when they Israeli tanks, when they went down the streets of Ramallah, they crushed the cars on either side of the street. And what she did was that she took the crushed cars and she put them on a tarmac that she created at cars, and they had a launch for the installation. And she took 2 photographs that day because she was very busy, and she thought, well, I'll take more photographs later. But that night the Israelis came back in tanks. They saw the installation. They ran over the cars again and destroyed them in the field. And then they got out of their tanks and they peed on the installation. And what was really interesting is Vera Tamari was living across the street, and she filmed the whole thing and made a film out of what happened to her installation. And it's this kind of attitude towards the occupation to show what goes on, but also kind of a cheeky attitude towards it. That's what gives that art and that installation power. And we were really happy to have the only 2 photographs she had taken on the day.
There were a few specific entries I wanted to get into, but before we did that, I want to go back to that bigger picture. And I was trying to put it into words earlier, but I think the way I would put it is we've lived in an age of really, I would say, massive, at least in America, massive dehumanization of Arabs and especially Palestinians in the past 20 years. And I think it's important that we engage with Palestinian culture just because there's been this campaign to sort of dehumanize and otherize Palestinian voices and to even try to erase their culture. And I think for me, that's why this book is so important, because I can show this book to someone who knows nothing of Palestine and they will start to understand this is a people with a culture. These are people with interior lives. They have thoughts, they create art, they produce things. And I think that's the value of this book. Can you speak more to that?
I think that definitely Sumūd is a platform for Palestinian voices. And I think that the voices are strong enough to speak for themselves. Like if you are able to create a platform where they can show their art, they can think, they can talk out loud about their aspirations, they can analyze their own poetry and history, and really kind of I don't know, like just show who they are, speak for themselves. I think that's the main thing that hasn't gone on for the last 20 years when we talk about Arab culture. And so the Arabs are never invited to the table to speak for themselves. And I think that's the real difference now with the rise of social media, with the rise of alternative media, is that people can speak for themselves. That these points of view, they don't seem. One thing I think I always remember what Edward Said said was that when he was writing, 20 years ago, he said that something to the effect that, you can find out about Palestine, but it's on the periphery. You have to go to the periphery to find out about Palestine. Now I feel that Palestine has kind of moved, and Palestinians themselves and their voices have moved closer into the mainstream. Now there is some kickback, payback to that there is like a concerted effort to stop pro-Palestinian protests, to stop pro-Palestinian, to censor Palestinian voices in literature. There is like this concerted effort to hide, to erase, to stop them, but they're still there. And I think that that's the thing that's going on now, is that it's because the war on Gaza was genocide in real time on people's phones. People wanted to know why the Palestinians are being treated like that. What have they done to even to undergo this genocide? and that they weren't going to be able to find out from periphery news or on X, because when people were talking about Palestine, they were being censored, or on, some of the mainstream channels also, although sometimes what was going on there was covered, that they had to look for other sources. They had to look for Palestinian voices. They wanted to hear from the Palestinians themselves. And I think that that's what's happened now. I mean, that's like a phenomenon that's happening now, is that because of the war on Gaza, because people were so curious, now you're going to see a rise of Palestinians speaking for themselves, and their culture, their art, their literature, their poetry is going to be more readily available. It may not be more readily available in perhaps mainstream publishing, but there's enough independent publishing that's going on that you can find it easily, and that you don't have to look too hard for it. I think it really has to do with the way that people saw the genocide on their phones, that they need to hear something else, that they're looking for something else, and they're actively looking for something. They're looking for the Palestinians. And actually, there are enough outlets, whether we're talking about the Markaz Review, we're talking about Seven Stories Press, we're talking about City Lights or Verso. There's enough of these smaller presses that are putting out new books and material.
One piece I wanted to talk about in this book that I thought was really interesting was there's a piece in it called, I believe it's called Application 39. And I thought it was an
Oh,
interesting inclusion because it was sort of like, I don't know if I'd say science fiction, but like speculative fiction, near future speculative fiction. Can you talk
yes.
about that story? Because I think it shows you a different side to everything when it comes to the type of art that's shown in this book. It's a very interesting inclusion.
Well, I definitely think it's like, I agree, it's science fiction stroke speculative fiction. Two hackers in Gaza City in the future, they play a joke. They decide that they want Gaza City to apply to host the Olympics, and they put in an application. And their application kind of, suddenly the city officials get involved. Suddenly, this joke becomes more of a reality. But also, this is at a time when Ahmed Massoud, who's the writer, who's from Gaza and who's had a hard time during the war. This is at a time when Gaza City, Ramallah, Nablus, they're all city states. There's no continuous country of Palestine. They're all city states. So, but and also there are tunnels underneath the West Bank and also underneath the Gaza Strip that connects everything. But also there's a very hard and awful Israeli occupation controlling the skies. So what I found really interesting about Application 39 that was written before October 7th is that drones really figure in the story, and that these hackers figure out a way that they can disable the drone and control it. So, at the same time that we were hearing about drones during the war on Gaza, Israeli drones would come down and talk to people on the ground and say, to aid, humanitarian aid workers, who are you? Show me your ID. Open up your car. Let me look in your trunk. That story also had people walking in the streets of Gaza that were being confronted by drones. And it's sort of like that, okay, maybe it was speculative fiction or science fiction that Ahmed Massoud was writing about, before. But by the time, the war on Gaza happened, that was happening, that was taking place. So I find that in that story, sometimes I think about culture is that there's a kind of prophecy that culture can do. There's a kind of prophecy in fiction that writers are imagining the future, and then somehow the future comes faster than we all imagined. And Application 39, I think, is really that encapsulates my kind of weirdo idea about prophecy, that this Gazan writer imagined this and it arrived. He foretold the future. Um, What's interesting about Ahmed Massoud is that we're having a launch tomorrow at P21 Gallery in London for the UK publication of the book. And we're hoping that Ahmed will join us and read from his from application 39. But the last time I saw him talk at an Amos Trust event, he talked about how he was writing about the physical plant of Gaza. He read something that he was recently writing where he's taking a walk through a part of the city of Gaza City. Well, that part of Gaza City has been bombed. It's gone. And I think that that's the power of good writing, is that it can foretell the future and it can memorialize the past. And I think that when we're talking about the Arabs or the Palestinians, because they're in the cold face of occupation and war, their experience is accelerated, so that you are kind of like in this accelerated experiences that they're having, that kind of tell us what it's like to be, the target. And that's one of the things I think that application 39 tells us.
Yeah, it's real that story was very interesting to me too, because like you said, there's a lot of references, drones figure heavily into it. And I think, what's interesting to me about um, Palestinians who write about the experience of having drone surveillance around them at all times is that I think that's going to be coming home. What I mean is, Americans use that against other populations now. It's coming to America as we become more, our police becomes more heavily militarized. So that
Yeah,
story was very interesting to me. And I also thought it was interesting. There's sort of a dark humor.
there is a black humor in that story,
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that because I think
because that's really unexpected. I think that people think that the Palestinians are very earnest, but they're very funny. I mean, like Vera Tamari and her installation, she's very funny. She's very funny about it. Ahmed Massoud in his story, there's like the two hackers are like they're guys that they're troublemakers, and they're pushing the limits of technology, and they're jokers, they're jesters. So that, I think, is like that's another thing that people don't think about when they think about the Palestinians, or they think that the Syrians also have like really, they have a lot of black humor, and the Egyptians have a lot of black humor. And when you live in totalitarian societies, or when you live under occupation, humor might be the only thing that you can arm yourself with. Like what's happening in America now. America's going to discover a new humor in how to combat what's going on. It's not all going to be hand wringing and, oh, woe is me. No. The way to fight this stuff, the way to stand up to it is with black humor.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. Is I think sometimes people miss that when because I've read other sort of Palestinian literature and poetry, including other selections in this book, and there is that sort of sense of humor, and I do think there is a way that humor and resistance are connected, and I think you express that very well.
Oh, yeah. I agree. The Iranians have it too. The Iranians have it too. It's different but the same. And it all goes back to this idea of accelerated experiences. For a long time, America hasn't been at war at home. For a long time, it hasn't had to confront the things or the issues that it's confronting now. Like in 2009, there was a coup in Iran. The Revolutionary Guards took over everything, in a way that, it was still a religious government, but the more extreme elements took over. We might be watching that now in the United States, perhaps.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the poetry in this book. I mean, there's a number of poems in here. I'll talk about the one that really stood out to me, but maybe you could just talk about your favorite selections of poetry in this book and why that poetry is so important. Because I feel like the collection of poetry you have in here, it's placed at various points in the book, I think very deliberately, and I think
Yeah.
it's very pivotal to the experience of reading the book.
Yes, it is. One thing that I spent like 3 or 4 days with post-it notes with the names of essays, poems, stories, and I put them on my office wall. And I spent hours moving them around and thinking about the rhythm of the book. What is it that the reader needs to know first? And how much of it does the reader have to have before there can be a kind of breathing space? Now, some people would say that poetry is somehow a moment of contemplation, but also poems can be a moment of protest. My favorite poet in the book is Noor Hindi. Noor Hindi comes from Akron, Ohio. I grew up in Akron, Ohio. She comes from a Palestinian family in Akron, Ohio. I come from a Jordanian Filipino family from Akron, Ohio, where Palestine was at the heart of our family conversations. And from Noor Hindi's poems, Palestine was at the heart of her family culture. And what I find about Noor Hindi is that she has that anger and that drive in her poems that the same frustration that I felt growing up in Akron, Ohio, and the same frustration I have as an Arab American. And I think that so it was important for me to include a couple of her poems, but there's one line that really just floors me that she wrote was that and I think it's not in fuck your lecture on craft, my people are dying, but
By the
it's
way,
in,
that's the one that stood out to me.
oh, is that the one that stood out to
I
you?
like that one.
Oh, that's a great poem. That's a fantastic poem because it gives you a sense of how people teach poetry, or they think that poetry should be about flowers, or that, somehow poets need to follow a certain meter or rhyme. But, all of that pales in comparison because her people are being shot and killed in front of her. And that in Pledge of Allegiance, the other poem that I include, there's a line there where she says, "I know I'm American because something dies when I walk into the room." And that was like, yo, man, that's it. That's America's relationship with the Middle East in 2 lines right there. So I think that Noor Hindi is a very important poet. I also think that Mossab Abu Toha is his experience as a Gazan poet, his experiences. He joined us when we had our event for the book for Sumūd at NYU. And afterwards, he told me a very interesting story. He said that it must have been, I said to him, I said, well, in America, they're going to want you to write a novel because that's how they are, poetry. They want a novel by a poet. And he said, well, like 3 years ago, uh, when Hamas had arrested him and beaten him up, he had started a novel. But then, all this other stuff got in the way, and he just has it's an ongoing project. And then just last year, the Israelis arrested him and beat him up and held him and stopped him from leaving. And he said, well, that's the continuation of the novel. But I think that Musab Abu Toha, he has a new book out. He's a poet that the New Yorker is publishing. I think that he's going to emerge as the voice of Palestine. He's an amazing fellow, and he read his poem that we include in the book, Palestine A to Z, but he updated it as he was going along, as he was reading the entries. Another poet who is very powerful is, of course, Mohammed El Kurd. And the poem that we have by him is I think it's elderly woman falls asleep on my shoulder, and it's about a bus ride that he takes with an older woman who's carrying figs that she's going to sell, and they go through the checkpoint together. And it really gives you a sense of the fortitude of older Palestinian women, that they've had to live under occupation for so long, and they've had to deal with Israeli soldiers that have no idea of their lives. And that anger and that anger and that pride in that elderly woman is very apparent in that poem. And then the last poem, the poet, we close Sumūd with a poem by Hala Alian, who is a clinical psychologist, writer, novelist, memoirist, and her poem is Habibti Ghazal. And that poem is, to me, it's sort of like a love swoon, but also a, I don't know, it has some kind of real energy and defiance in it. And it's also about love and the future. And that was the moment that the book ends, and I wanted to end on that. So that's a roundup of the poems, I think.
Yeah, like I said, "Fuck Your Craft" by People Are Dying was a very interesting one for me. It stood out. I mean, there's a lot of, I think what stood out for me was the passion, and the righteous sort of anger. Uh,
Yeah.
and, you know, one thing that I thought while reading some of the poetry and some of the other selections in this volume is I've been covering Palestine for a number of years now, even going back to when I was still in college. I was doing the show while I was in college, and people uh,
Good on you.
Thank you. But people at my college who weren't familiar with the issue would just say, "Oh, it's very sad what's happening to the Palestinians." They would ask me if the Palestinians are just a sad people over what's happening, and they would talk about the suffering. And I'm not trying to downplay I mean, obviously, there's a lot of suffering that Palestinians have faced. I think that goes without saying. But they're not just a people that suffer. They also find joy in resistance, I think. And I
Enjoy.
wish more people realize that. It's not, there are people that have persevered, which is why they're so incredible.
Yes, yes. Should I read her poem, Noor
If
Hindi's
you want to,
poem? Do we
yeah,
have
that would be
time?
great.
Yeah. Fuck Your Lecture on Craft, My People Are Dying by Noor Hindi. Colonizers write about flowers. I tell you about children throwing rocks at Israeli tanks seconds before becoming daisies. I want to be like those poets who care about the moon. Palestinians don't see the moon from jail cells and prisons. It's so beautiful, the moon. They're so beautiful, the flowers. I pick flowers for my dead father when I'm sad. He watches Al Jazeera all day. I wish Jessica would stop texting me happy Ramadan. I know I'm American because when I walk into a room, something dies. Metaphors about death are for poets who think ghosts care about sound. When I die, I promise to haunt you forever. One day I'll write about the flowers like we own them. So I was wrong about the line. The line was in fuck your lecture on craft, my people are dying, and not in Pledge of Allegiance. So I apologize.
Well, I think that whole poem gets at the heart of what I was saying a moment ago too, that there's joy and sort of resistance in telling, your truth, at least that I see in that poem. Can you speak to that? Do you think that's an important aspect of Palestinian culture and identity that may get overlooked by some people who are not familiar with the culture?
I think that speaking the truth, or speaking their, for them to speak their truth, for so long, they were not allowed to speak their truth. For so long, We talk about art, we were talking about art before. The early art exhibitions in school halls and town halls or wherever they were being held, IDF soldiers would go, and make sure, and corral and police the artists or police the exhibitions. So for so long, there are things that they couldn't say in public. There were things that they couldn't write about, there are still things that they can't say now. And I think that being able to speak your truth, or there for them to be able to say what's going on, is very empowering, because for a long time they haven't been allowed to say it, or for a long time it was ignored, or for a long time they were told they didn't exist. So I think that, speaking truth to power is empowering and means a lot. And I think that, I don't know, we're in the age now of very strong opinions, that people really state what they mean or how they feel, or what they believe in. And I think that that should be also, the Palestinians can take that ground too. They've earned it. They've been fighting occupation for quite a long time, and they're still here. So this isn't like the first generation or the second generation. We're into, like, generations of family who have been seeing this. Like, for example, one of the essays in the book is by the well-known Palestinian writer and human rights lawyer Raja Shihada. And he's talking about a bike ride he did after the 67 war. That landscape has all changed since then. But just that this guy could do it is kind of a small miracle. He couldn't do, no kid in Palestine, no 20 something, especially young man, can get on his bike and ride around and go through checkpoints. That's not what's happening today. So I think it's good that we have work in the book that shows a different past to the kind of present that we have now, and that we have work where people are actually expressing their emotions and their anger, in, I would say, in artful ways.
Can you talk about the contribution of the co-founder of the Gaza Theater for Everybody in the book?
Oh, yes, of course. Hossam Madhoun.
I didn't want to mispronounce his name. That's why. Okay.
No, Hossam Madhoun. What was really interesting is that Jonathan Chadwick has a theater company here called the AZ Theater. And he's worked with Hossam Madhoun and his theater in Gaza. And when the war started, Hossam started sending out these daily missives about what was going on in his life and in his family's life. And we published 4 installments of his writing at the Markaz Review. And I took the selection of his daily diaries from what we had published, and um, it. I mean, they're amazing. They're amazing for their detail. I mean, he talks about what it's like walking home at night through an area that's been bombed. He talks about what's happening to the olive trees and the failed cultivating season because of the war. um you know he also like talks about, he has a little white dog named Buddy, and he talks about, like, when they're sleeping, he and his wife are sleeping, and when the bombing starts, Buddy, like, is in bed with them, but he jumps over their heads. He has a anxiety attack at the sound of the bombing. He Hassam's writing is kind of amazing. He also talks about, like, when he's looking for electricity, because there was no electricity, there was no water, food was scarce. Like people who did have generators, they would set up these charging stations in their front yard, and people would leave their laptops and their phones there and just get them charged. He also talks about the experience of that he and his wife have. They're visiting people in hospitals, but also they to get home, they catch a ride with a young man who has a donkey cart, and this conversation that they have, with this young man, about what his life is like during the war. And Hossam's wife asked the young man, his name is Ahmed, what is it what do you think will happen, Ahmed? And Ahmed says, well, the Israelis' dream is to see Gaza empty by any means. They will keep striking, bombing, destroying, killing until they push us out or kill us all. And Hossam's wife Abir says, and what do you think we should do? And this young kid, I mean, how old is he? He's like 13 years old or something. He says, do what we do now, stay and live. I mean, that's something that maybe President Trump has to hear from the mouth of a young donkey driver, for God's sake. I mean, Hossam Madhoun's essays were an eye opener for me at the Markaz. They meant they made me understand what it must be like for ordinary people, people who, we always think of like the heroes of war, or people who have enormous courage during war. The ordinary people of Gaza are incredibly courageous during war. And I think that's what Hossam communicated to me through his diary entries. And that's why I wanted to open Sumūd with these voices of courage, with these, with experiences that I don't think people really understood who haven't lived through war like that.
I was going to say, so with regards to the structure of the
Uh-huh.
book, is there sort of were the pieces that open the book sort of strategically placed? Like, was there, I don't know how to put it, but did you have an idea of going from point A to B, sort of? Like you open the book with messages from Gaza now, then you move to Palestine and the Unspeakable by Lina Munzor. Was there a sort of way that you wanted it organized?
I
I
think
hope that
that
makes sense.
no, it does make sense. Everything in a book is constructed.
Right.
Everything that's written is constructed. And for me, as the co-editor of this book, is that I had the real sense of that I was taking the reader by the hand, and I was taking them through a very thick and dark wood, a very thick and dark jungle or forest. And that actually I needed them to pause along the way so that they were able to understand that, like in Lina Munzor's essay, which was written only a couple of weeks after the war on Gaza started, was that there was language, the word genocide, apartheid, colonial settler state, even the word ceasefire, that you weren't allowed to use. Those words you weren't allowed to use, because the Israelis were telling us this was a just war. These were precision strikes. So it was important for me to have Hossam Madhoun telling us really what it's like to live through this awful, awful experience. And also to have Lina tell us how that this just war was unjust, and that this book really was going to document a time that was in transition. This is a time of war. So then from Lena, you have the artwork of Khalil Rabe,
I wanted to
Palestine,
ask about that
Philistine.
specifically,
Is
the
that,
Palestine Philistine, because I thought it was a very interesting. It was a, I mean, it was a conceptual art project, so I was interested in that inclusion
is a
because
conceptual art project, but also it's a project that really is talking about language because it's nails in a thesaurus on a into a book, nails hammered into a book, and the only definition that you see is Philistine. And Philistine is, what does Philistine mean? It means ignoramus, it means barbarian. These are, as Wafa Raz from the Dalul Art Foundation writes, Rabi poignantly examines the deep roots of rhetorical violence that connects a common phrase to the international dehumanization of Palestinians. And this book was made while that international dehumanization of Palestinians were taking place right in front of us. And this book for me was my way of being politically active. This was a way that I could get Palestinians to speak for themselves and to really move it along so that we could get it published and that they could be out there talking for themselves. They don't really need me as as a middle person. They're able, those arguments stand up themselves.
that's why the Palestine Philistine section stood out to me was, it did remind me. I've seen a lot of dehumanization of Palestinians and also just the Arab world since the War on Terror when I was, just a little kid.
Yeah.
And it really stood out to me because I think, now you have people that can speak for themselves that are pushing back on that.
Yeah.
And I think, the younger generation now is fed up with this. I think they're tired of this dehumanization, and I think they're tired of seeing what's being done in our name. I mean, there's so many young people now that are pushing back against
Yeah.
what is happening in Gaza. I don't know if you want to, before we close out, maybe you could speak to that.
I think what I worked with a very interesting young editor at Seven Stories Press. I've been writing about Palestine for a really long time. And, I found that in my long history of writing about Palestine, if it was political stories, nobody was interested. If it was cultural stories, you could kind of get their attention. And working with Tal Mancini at Seven Stories Press, I learned that Tal's generation, his generation, is that they didn't need Sumūd translated on the cover of the book. They knew what Sumūd was. They didn't need things explained to them because they understood. They had already come to an understanding about Palestine. You didn't have to. I don't know. Um, I didn't have to start the book with October 7th because that's that a lot of the reviews of Sumūd, they're always starting with October 7th. Matter of fact, they'll spend more time talking about October 7th than they'll talk about the voices, Palestinian voices in the book. That's a mainstream, and that's kind of a skewed way of looking at this collection. These voices speak for themselves. If you spend time in this book, you will come out of this book with another understanding about Palestine, one that's authentic and comes from the ground up. And that's what I wanted to do as an editor, and also to honor this material because it should be readily available. And I feel that Seven Stories Press has made it readily available.
Just a few more things, if you have a few more minutes. There
Yeah.
were a few more things I wanted to cover. Uh, I know we can't go over every piece in the book, but I wanted to talk about the art in the book, the visual art, and we kind of did that already with the Palestine Philistine um, segment of the book. But there's also watchtowers and then the art of the poster that I thought were really interesting. And I think the visual aspect of this book is very important.
I think I wanted to include art, and Tasir Batnaji's Watchtower series, I was really taken with. He was inspired by Bernd and Hilla Becker's photographs of European post-industrial water towers. And those photographs, I don't know if you've ever seen them. They're very stark, they're black and white, and it gives you a sense of like an industrial past, something from so long ago. But these watchtowers that Batnerjee, he's a Gazan artist. Because he's a Gazan artist, he's not allowed to travel in the West Bank. So he found a photographer who could photograph these watchtowers, these Israeli watchtowers that are watching Palestinian populations. And these photographs, there's something kind of grainy about them. They're not pristine, they're not perfect. Some of them are blurred because no one's allowed to take photographs of Israeli watchtowers in the West Bank. You're not allowed to do that. But also, these watchtowers reminded me of the watchtower. There was a photographer that we published photographs of. He had photographed the British watchtowers in Northern Ireland because this kind of architecture, military industrial architecture, it's this oppressive architecture is the same the world over. And I kind of felt that the story of Batnerjee finding this photographer who would take these photographs under duress, that he was inspired by these German industrial water towers, but also that I was reminded of these British watchtowers in Northern Ireland. There was like a very interesting line of intent or inspiration that kind of joined us all together. And that's why I wanted to include the series in the book. You mentioned another artist that you like, that the posters.
Right. The art of the poster, I think,
The
was the
art of the
title.
poster that was an essay that was written by Nadine Aranki, who's a West Bank curator. And what we're doing is that we are going to have an exhibition of Palestinian political posters at P21 during the Shubak Middle East Festival in May and June of this year. But what was amazing about the posters is that posters have a very special history in as a campaigning tool in the long history of Palestine, and that especially during the Lebanese Civil War, the PLO would use posters to bring attention to what was going on in Palestine and in Lebanon, and also to build solidarity outside of the Middle East. And the posters that we're showing in the book, these are from a poster exhibition. Most of them are from a poster exhibition called Posters for Gaza. That's a Zyway gallery in Ramallah and Dubai had show these posters. And in Ramallah, that was very hard to bring in the original posters. So they printed A3 posters and put a QR code, and you're able to order the posters if you want to have a copy of them. But also, we included a poster from Artists Against Apartheid, and Victoria Gracia, whose Freedom for Palestine series, she uses this iconic, historic Palestinian images of fedayeen, or women with machine guns. And for her posters, that really most of it is saying freedom for Palestine in Arabic and in English. I think that the posters are very powerful, and I think that posters are
Well,
an
what is
art
the
form.
power in those posters for you?
For me, I think it's like it really encapsulates a message quickly. Like, for example, we have this one poster by Khaled Al-Haber, who actually is a Lebanese musician. And his poster the title of it is very satirical, very ironic. We're doing fine in Gaza. What about you? And it's a picture of a building being blown up, you know, and it's reminding us that things aren't fine in Gaza. And how come we're not doing anything about it? Like in a nutshell. There's another poster that we're showing by Dalala Mushtaha. It's called Freedom in Bloom. It has an older man in a kafia. His back is towards us. That posture with the back towards us is like Hamdallah, the Palestinian cartoon character, is that the world has turned their back on Palestinians, and he's looking into a wall, and there he's surrounded by Jaffa oranges and by the eye that looks like from Lishan Andalou, and a phone, and these are the things that kind of really evoke Palestine, and yet he's not looking at us, he's looking away from us. And then there's another poster by Haneen Nazal, Against, and this is of a figure with a gun, and she's used the Arabic from a poetry, from a poem by Rashid Hussein, and the translation of which she's provided: against a child, any child becoming a hero at 10, against the rosebuds becoming trenches, and yet, after the burning of my land, my comrades, and my youth, how can my poems not become guns? And I think that that's like a very stark reminder of radicalization happens when there's only violence in someone's life.
Yeah, I think that's very important because Jordan's own entry, I think, is very valuable. They kill writers, don't
Incredibly.
they? Because, I always hear this very propagandistic line of, well, why don't the Palestinians have their own Gandhi? And it always annoys me because whenever a nonviolent voice rises up in Palestinian society, they're shut down, they're put in
They're
jail, or
killed,
they're
they're
killed.
assassinated. All moderate Palestinian political leaders have been assassinated. you know there's probably the only person who can lead Palestine in jail now,
Are you talking
so
about Barghouti or?
Barghouti, yeah. So I mean, it's kind of amazing. And I think the thing for Jordan was that when he was growing up, this idea that writers should be killed because they write just seemed like incredible to him. It seemed like the world upside down. He couldn't make sense of it. And yet his essay really goes through like how writers are always deemed a threat by totalitarian regimes. So it's hard for anyone to think that Israel, as it claims, is the only democracy in the Middle East. How can it be a democracy in the Middle East when it kills writers? It's killed all these journalists in Gaza. It's destroyed all these universities in Gaza, not to mention the hospitals or anything else you want to go into.
There's also a segment of the book that I think deals with the looting of Palestinian culture by like IDF soldiers, even. And I think that's an important segment of the book because I think w there's an attempt to erase Palestinian culture and Palestinian identity. And when you loot and erase an identity, you're taking away their humanity. You're sort of otherizing, and I mean a people's culture is their humanity in a lot of ways. It shows their humanity.
It
And there's an
yeah.
attempt to take that away. Can you speak to that?
That essay is by Olivia Snage, who's an American writer living in Paris. And Olivia's essay is incredibly key to the book because it really talks about how the archaeological sites of Gaza have been looted, bombed, looted, and Israeli soldiers have been seen on the internet with these artifacts. And these artifacts are taken from Gaza and put into Israeli museums and will be, the labels will not say really where they're from or what they're about. This idea that there were no Palestinians there, that historically they've never been there. Well, they've been doing excavation of these sites, not only in Gaza, but in the sea, in the Mediterranean Sea around Gaza. Gaza was a very important stop on the Silk Road. So this was all a very important this history, this incredible history, this ancient history. Somehow the Israelis are trying to erase it, because you're right, if you erase a people's history, that's one way. Another way of erasing the people. And what's great about Olivia Snage's essay is that there are many organizations, whether we're talking and people, whether we're talking inside Gaza or outside Gaza, that are keen to get those excavations started again. And they're already talking about it. And somehow, they trained a lot of young Gazans to excavate and to work on those sites. And those people are going to come back and excavate again.
We talked about how you opened the book. I wanted to talk briefly here about how you close it. We mentioned later in the book, very close to the end, you have the art of the poster section. But after that, you have a chapter that stood out to me because my listeners will know who I'm talking about here, Sarah Roy. Uh,
Yeah.
and that's a very interesting piece to sort of start closing out the book on. Sarah Roy is, of course, considered one of the foremost experts on Gaza, so I think my listeners will be very interested in reading that. But was there a reason you chose to sort of start closing out the book on the Ivor Eklund and Sarah Roy piece?
I
I
thought it
think it
was
was Disrupting the Colonial Gaze was the name of it.
yes, disrupting the colonial gaze, Gaza and Israel after October 7th. I thought it was important there aren't that many essays that are pure political analysis in the book. And I felt that it was important to include one where Eklund and Roy are really looking at genocide, forced or voluntary emigration, um, you know, talking about the instrument, referring to the work of the philosopher Judith Butler, and how you instrumentalize the killing of a people. And I think that's the one thing that Sarah Roy is very good at, is this analysis of how Israel has acted, what they're trying to do, and that also to call out that the level of inhumanity that is revealed in Gaza is unprecedented since the Holocaust and the colonial wars. I think it's important to have a real think by the end of the book of what the war has done to Palestine, but also to Israel. Also, to have a clear idea of, how the international community legitimizes Israelis occupation, and just so that we all know where we stand, so that we're able to get ready to fight harder. I think that that's really important. And I think that also in the essay, she does acknowledge the change that has come about in terms of perceptions about Palestine. And I think that's important. Like, that's important to close on.
What do you think about that? What do you mean by changing perceptions? Maybe for my audience, what do you think the change has been?
I think the change of perception is that younger generation that we've been talking about, that they're tired of the same old, and they want to understand something better. And I think that there's a change, that people do see Israel as South Africa, that this is not just a religion. For a long time, the conflict was always framed as a religious war. This is not a religious war. This is about a powerful oppressor against a weaker people of color. And, racism is inherent in this. Colonialism is inherent in this fight. All the isms are there. And I think that people are realizing it. I think that there's been because of the violence and because of the level of violence in the occupation that's taking place right now, and that you have an American president that thinks he can build a resort on the mass graves of people.
Well,
You
just
know,
even that line of like, we're going to take over Gaza. America's going to take over Gaza. Just
yeah,
this like erasure game that is played.
yeah,
It's like the Palestinians are treated like they have no autonomy. They're just erased, and
yeah.
it's grotesque.
It is grotesque, and I think that people can see that. Or I would say that some people are seeing it more readily than others. And that depends on whether they're Zionist or they're anti-Zionist. And I think that what's great about Sarah Roy, or what's great about her essay, is that it's anti-Zionist. What's great about a lot of the political analysis in the book is that it's anti-Zionist. And I think that that's important. That's what the Palestinians are really, they're fighting Zionism. And this might be the last great colonial movement. So the pushback is going to be intense. That's why all of us need to be aware and to be informed.
So I want to close with this. When I opened the book, I was pleasantly surprised by some of the praise I saw for it, and one name stood out to me, but I want to read their quote first. It's astonishing to me that despite the blizzard of barbarism currently being visited on them, Palestinians continue to produce such stunning writing. This excellent compilation is essential reading. And that was praise heaped on this book that we've been talking about by Brian Eno, one of the
Yeah,
great musicians
yeah.
of our time, one of the greatest electronic and ambient musicians, just, I mean, an amazing figure in music history. And I was like, oh my God, Brian Eno is a fan.
Brian Eno is a fan, but more importantly, Brian Eno is a Palestinian activist.
Right.
He has been active with Palestine for a long time. He's an incredible supporter of not only Palestinian letters, but literature from the Middle East. He's been a great supporter of he gave me an endorsement for my novel Mother of All Pigs, and he's been a great supporter and friend to Saki Books in London, which is a Middle Eastern publisher that publishes all sorts of wonderful fiction, and nonfiction from the region. So of course I had to turn to him to see if he wouldn't mind to look at an early PDF of the book, and if he liked it, would he give us a endorsement? I'm I'm honored that he gave us those words.
Well, I think that's a great note to close on. And I want to thank you again, Malu, for coming on Parallax Views. How can my listeners keep up with your work and how can they get the book?
They can get the book from any independent bookshop, and I hate to say it, but you can get it online. And to know about my work is really come visit us at the Markaz Review. We're working on a variety of really great writing, stories, short fiction, and yes, and that's where good work is taking place. So, join us there. And also, we have a lot of Palestinian and, writers from around the world. And we want to enlarge not only your worldview, but our worldview. And thanks for having me.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, if you appreciate the work here I do on the show, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.